I'm proud to introduce Doug Shaw. He's with the Texas Water Development Board. Doug is the Agricultural and Rural Texas Ombudsman with the Texas Water Development Board, and I do want to point out that the Texas Water Development Board funds the Texas Alliance for Water Conservation. The demonstration project is really important to us and to our industry, and without the Texas Water Development Board, this wouldn't be happening. So Doug Shaw, if you would please come up and address the group. He is the project manager and ombudsman. In the past, he's been the project manager. He's also been the agricultural economist with the Texas Water Development Board. He holds a BS and MS degree, both from Tarleton State University. Doug, welcome.
A little bit of background about myself. I grew up on a dairy in Godley, Texas, just west of Fort Worth. Went to school at Tarleton State University, studied agricultural economics. Ended up coming right after I finished grad school. Started working with the Texas Water Development Board, working primarily helping develop annual irrigation estimates. Worked on developing projections for regional water planning. Did some socioeconomic impact analysis, basically really aimed at agriculture, the impact agriculture, and what the impact would be without water to each region. And then I guess a couple years ago I started working as a project manager in regional water planning. Worked with Regions A. If you aren't familiar with Region A, which is the northern, really 2/3 of the Panhandle, Region O, which is this area, Region F, south here, all the way down to San Angelo, and then Region B around Wichita Falls. So I know this area of the state pretty well. Been around quite a bit, been around a lot of the water folks, understand the agriculture industry and what that means to this economy out here. So I guess, due to recent legislation, which I'm not going to really talk about, I'll leave that up to Director Brune here a little bit. We had some new board members come in this past fall, and one of the first things they did, and it's something that I had heard throughout the years as my time as a project manager for the Water Development Board, that rural Texas, ag industry, what really wasn't being represented. People were worried that this huge pot of money they were talking about last session was all going to go to the big cities. So our board came in, they wanted to really basically create a position within the agency, someone that would really work with outreach in rural Texas, help represent, bring issues that I'm hearing back out in the state, back to our board so that they're aware of these issues. And whenever I interviewed for the job, I told them, I was like, look, it's like, you want somebody that's not from Austin, because I understand, somebody that's born and raised in Austin comes out to rural Texas, West Texas, people know it, you can smell it from a mile away. I was like, you want somebody, it's true. I was like, you want somebody that understands the rural Texas mindset. It's like, never in my life have I met anyone as rural Texan as my father. He had a big influence on me. He and I get along well, so I think I can do this. They chose me for the job, and basically I've spent the last 6 months just traveling around the state. A lot of you I've seen before. I do a lot of public speaking, a lot of setting in on meetings. Just really enjoying what I'm doing, honestly. I drive about 3,000–4,000 miles a month, just all over the state, mostly in West Texas. I was down in San Angelo yesterday. I was out there last week. I'll be back up here in another month or so. So anyway, I'm going to get started my presentation. A little bit about my role. Like I said, outreach in rural parts of the state. Just a lot of, just traveling around, doing speaking in events like this. I've spoke at Farm Bureau events, AgriLife events. I'll be up in Vernon in a couple weeks speaking to AgriLife agents up there. Also ensuring that concerns the ag industry in rural Texas reach our board. Historically, we've always had people that, attend meetings around the state. One thing our new board really wants to make sure they're hearing what the real concerns of people around the state are. And historically, I know in my past position as a project manager, I'd hear something, I'd go back, I'd tell it to my manager, and that message would get filtered on its way up. And now it's just, now if I'm hearing something, I'll go directly to Director Brune, his chief of staff, like, I'm hearing something that's concerning me. Point of contact, and this is really aimed more at the municipal water use. A lot of big cities, they have, engineers on the books, consulting engineers that work with the Water Development Board, know our programs front and back. They know who to talk to. some of these small communities, I use Godley, a small town where I grew up as an example. City of Godley, when I was growing up, had maybe 2-3 employees. And if they needed some funding for water infrastructure, nobody would have known where to even start. They probably would have got passed around, from person to person, trying to get a hold of the right person for water development board. So I'm basically working as that point of contact. I get my name out there, my contact information out there. Folks give me a call, I listen to them, I find out what it is they need exactly, and I get them, if I can't answer their question or if I can't help them directly, I get them right to the person they need to talk to. And also help engage rural entities in the planning process, which I'm going to talk mostly about the planning process and kind of the role agriculture plays in that today. Of course, that's what I'm most comfortable talking about. It's what I did for the really first 8 years I was at the board. So, a little brief history of the Water Development Board. 1957, in the response to the drought of record in the 1950s, which, as you know, most of the folks in West Texas know, we may be in the middle of a new drought of record right now. But in response to the drought of the late 40s and early 50s, 1957, the Texas legislature created the Texas Water Development Board. Served basically two main functions: to undertake long-term or long-range water planning for the state, and also kind of work as a bank to fund water infrastructure projects. Since that time, there have been 6 state water plans, or from 1957 to 1997, there were 6 state water plans developed under that process. And really, if you will, think of it as that was really a top-down process. You had a bunch of engineers, economists, sitting in Austin, identifying water demands around the state, developing strategies to meet future needs or shortages. And, for the most part, there was some great work. But those plans basically sit on the shelves and collected dust. They're real interesting to look at. There's one of them, I don't know if it's the first or second one, to talk about moving water from the Mississippi all the way to West Texas, I believe. They don't really talk a lot about irrigation in that, and there is some mention of it, but not to the extent we do now. So in the late 90s, there was another pretty serious drought. Quite a bit of economic losses. I'm sure most of you guys in this room maybe remember that. There's most of the agriculture losses. About 300 or so entities around the state reporting that they were, their water supply was endangered or threatened. So the legislature came back, and with Senate Bill 1, they created regional water planning, which I'm going to really expand on here in a second. The idea was to bring people, to make it a bottom-up process. Get folks in the region, in each area of the state, together, hire a consulting engineer, and really identify the demands and supplies in that region, develop strategies, and get people who would actually be implementing those strategies to develop them, instead of just, folks sitting in Austin doing this. The 3 state water plans, since this process has been implemented in 2002, 2007, 2012. We'll have another state water plan in just a couple of years. Actually, they're working on finishing up the regional water plans right now. And the current drought in 2013, SWIFT. Like I said, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that, but I'm sure some of y'all have read about that quite a bit. Like I said, state water planning, originally it was a top-down process, not a whole lot of local involvement. I don't know how much local input there was, if any, throughout those years. So, and then regional water planning, here's this, you can see the different regions. We're sitting here in Region O right now, Region A up in the northern panhandle. Legislation basically said, these are the statutory interest groups. At least one representative, or one person representing each of these categories will be a voting member on each planning group. Most planning groups have about 20, 25 voting members. But if you'll notice, agriculture is on there. In this part of the state, usually it's irrigators that represent that the agriculture interests in different parts of the state. You'll have folks from I believe there's a gentleman from the Wagner Ranch on the Region B. You'll have livestock, cattle people in other parts of the state. But up here, it's primarily irrigators representing that interest group up in these two in A and O. You also have, river authorities, water districts, folks actually involved with implementing water projects and meeting future water demands. So just in a nutshell, regional water planning, they project population and future water demands. Just step back a second. So this is a process that's funded by the state through our planning grants. We basically, through these grants, get this money's out to the regions. they go through and they post notice. They hire consulting engineers. In the planning group, the consulting engineers and staff of the Water Development Board work together, identify population demands, project those out 50 years. And of course, the population demands are going to drive municipal water use. And then also all other water demands. You can maybe see this here: municipal, manufacturing, mining, irrigation, steam, electric, and livestock. So basically all the consumptive uses of water. They identify what's being used right now, project that out 50 years, and then they also identify supplies, existing and future water supplies, and anywhere where there's a shortage, they develop, evaluate, and recommend strategies to meet that shortage. And they can also make policy recommendations. Of course, this is just a real general overview of the regional water planning process. Water management strategies, they're the projects or actions that are recommended to meet these future needs. Anything from conservation, I think conservation makes up about 1/3 of the strategies in the current plan. Wastewater reuse, desalination, surface or groundwater. New infrastructure. This is basically a lot of situations around the state. You'll have a source, you'll have a reservoir that's there. May not be all permitted out. The infrastructure may not be there. So some of the strategies are just simply to build the infrastructure to move that existing supply of water to an end user, or to a municipality, to a water provider. New surface water diversions or impoundments. Not a whole lot of new reservoirs in the current state water plan. There are a few. There's some off-channel reservoirs down in the lower Colorado Basin that will provide water, based on the plan for some of the rice farmers down there. And then new groundwater development. And this is also, this could anything from the purchase of groundwater rights to actually the building of ground well fields, or just infrastructure to move water from existing well fields to a new user. I'm going to talk real quick about the groundwater management process. It's tied into regional water planning in that, historically, up until this current round of planning, it was up to the consultants for each planning year to develop the supply estimates for both surface water and groundwater. This current round of planning, the legislature came out and said, we're going to use numbers that come out of this groundwater management area process for groundwater supplies. So these groundwater management areas are created in order to provide conservation, preservation, protection, and recharging prevention of waste of groundwater in Texas. They're made up of representatives from groundwater districts within each GMA. They're charged with adopting desired future conditions, and those desired future conditions are then submitted to the Water Development Board, and we use those to develop model available groundwater, which is that number that is used in regional water planning. So if you think of it like a desired future condition for the Ogallala, for example, for most of the counties that overlie the Ogallala, it's 50% of current capacity remaining in 50 years. And so to give a brief example, the way I explained this a while back, I explained it to my dad one time, and I thought it came out pretty well. It's like, think if you were to have a 5-gallon bucket of water, in 50 years you want 2.5 gallons of water left. So that would be your desired future condition. You submit that to the board. We have a model that basically all the water that we know is being drawn out of that bucket of water, the amount of water that's trickling back into that bucket of water, is all taken into account. And the model available groundwater is that amount of water that you can take out of that bucket on an annual basis and hit that 2.5 gallons in 50 years. And this is why it's really important that you have a really good idea of the amount of water that's actually being drawn out of the aquifer in each county. Because if you underestimate the amount of water that's being taken out, it's going to affect the amount of water that comes out the bottom of that model and how much water you can withdraw annually and still hit that desired future condition. And that's one real reason why we strive to get the best data possible. But I'll go through the process of how we estimate irrigation water use in a minute, and you'll see there's some gaps. There's areas where we can there's some in need of some better data. So you may ask, what is really the purpose? How does agriculture fit into this? What does irrigation have to do? And this shows it right here. As you folks well know, irrigation is the largest water user in Texas, consumptive water user. and it's projected to really stay that way. You know, this decline in irrigation is really driven by urbanization in certain parts of the state, you know, around down in the valley, you know, as you see some acres coming out of production, aquifer declines. But, you know, we're still seeing this number right here, this 10 million acre feet, you know, annual irrigation around the state. And it's, you know, it's very important. It's very important to make sure you understand that number, and because it really affects the rest of the water planning. It affects, you know, you got to know how much water is being used for irrigation, so you know how much water is there for the other uses. And as you all know, irrigation is extremely important to local economies. I explain this as I travel around the state, and I'm talking to a lot of folks that maybe don't understand, you know, where y'all are coming from as irrigators. You know, a lot of these small towns, you know, are built up around irrigated agriculture, and it's extremely important to their economy. And it's, you know, it's, I think, and a lot of people don't really get, it's not just that direct impact, that direct, you know, amount of money that the irrigated agriculture brings in. It's that second and third layer down, you know, the amount, all the implement dealers, the fertilizer dealers, hardware stores, and then it trickles down from there. So real quick, how we go about coming up with those numbers, and Cameron Turner is here. I don't know if any of y'all know him. I think probably most of y'all do. His team is in charge of developing these irrigation estimates. It's something I used to work closely with him in doing. Doing a little bit different than when I was working on it, so I'm not quite as familiar with it as I once was. But basically, they take a 5-year average irrigation water use, look at application rates, basically adjust that on based on weather data from different ET stations, different weather stations around the state. They take acreage, irrigated acreage from FSA, apply that application rate, and then that's the initial estimate. They send that out to all the groundwater districts around the state. You know, with the idea of that these folks from the groundwater districts, you know, they're going to have a better, you know, on the ground knowledge of the actual acreage, because as you may know, there's fewer of the total acreage actually planted each year. A smaller percentage of that is being reported to FSA. So we may be missing a lot of acreage some places. And then also, you know, our that application rate is something that, you know, we estimate, and we may be off. And you off a couple inches, spread out over a couple 100,000 acres, that adds up to a lot of water. So we say they mail that out to groundwater districts. We also, for surface water irrigation, we get surface water diversions from TCEQ, take that into account. And then, so this is something Cameron's group does. They mail these initial estimates out to the groundwater districts. They get their comments back. And, you know, for the most part, what the groundwater districts say, they take. You know, they take those comments and they make those adjustments, because our understanding is, or our thought is, we don't really have any better knowledge or better data. They probably know better than we do, so we're going to take their information. As you can see here, you know, this is just an example, you know, based on some comments from North Plains CCD, these estimates were changed. Acreage was added, application rates changed. And so that's why it's important for the groundwater districts, you know, if you're with the district, if you get these mail-outs, you know, to pay attention to these, because this is used in developing irrigation demands for regional water planning. This is kind of the basis for that. Accurate data improves models. As I mentioned earlier, you know, it's critical that we have accurate data. You know, it's absolutely impossible to plan properly and to do proper planning if you don't have good data. You're not really accounting for the water that's being used out there. So yeah, I mean, for regional water planning, for the regional water plans, the state water plans, it's absolutely necessary to have good data. For GAMS, as I mentioned when I was talking about the groundwater management process earlier, you know, if we don't have that good data, the amount of irrigation that's being used in the state, or in each county, you know, it really affects that number that comes out of that model for the model available groundwater, which could limit communities. I mean, you know, groundwater in the state of Texas is regulated on a local basis through groundwater districts. You know, we don't regulate groundwater in any way, but you know, if an entity like, you know, a small community, you know, Floyd Ada, Lockney, something like that, wanted to come into the Water Development Board for funding, to drill new wells or to expand their current well field. If those projects aren't included in the water plan, that may limit their availability of some of our funding mechanisms to them. And all our funding programs require that the project be consistent with the plan. And so, if you don't have a good idea of the amount of water that's actually being withdrawn from the aquifer, model available groundwater comes back lower than it should be, that could limit potential projects in the regional water plans for some of these communities around the state, which, that may limit their ability to come to the board and get funding, and they may have to go out to the open market and pay more. Whereas we could save them money with lower interest rates, deferred payments, stuff like that. So that's why it's really important that we have a good understanding of the water being used in the state of Texas. With that, just real quick to mention SWIFT, 10% from the SWIFT fund is dedicated each year to be used in rural Texas and to fund agriculture conservation projects. How and why fund these projects? They're low interest loans. We can fund these things. I'm going to go through just a brief list in a second of kind of projects that are in the plans. But if you're going to go to the open market, we can probably, I guarantee, we can almost always beat the rate you're going to get from a bank. You have potentially longer repayment terms, and even potentially deferred payments. One thing to keep in mind is the Water Development Board can only loan money to political subdivisions in the state of Texas. Historically, we've worked with some groundwater districts around the state. I believe the Panhandle GCD, is that right, Cameron? With our ag loans. Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District has come to us and taken out some loans, and then turned around and got that out to producers for new pivots, new stuff like that. So those are options, and with the SWIFT, I think those kinds of things would also be eligible. Of course, the SWIFT is only going to fund projects that are specifically identified in the regional water plans. So I just wanted to put up a couple in the current regional water plans, and keep in mind, the current regional water plans, when developing irrigation conservation strategies, they really weren't developed with funding in mind. Now that there's this pot of money that is available for these projects, I think you're going to see these fleshed out a little bit more. But just in the current plans, you see things like irrigation scheduling, soil probes, use of ET, things like that. Technology like is being used with this project could be potentially funded through some of our programs, which is why I guess recently, a couple months ago, I brought in some of the folks from Region O, the chairman, their political subdivision, the vice chair, in to meet with some TAWC folks, and so they can kind of start talking. So I think there's a potential there. I really do. I believe Rick maybe went and talked to the Region O planning group a while back, and like I said, there's some other stuff. Down in the valley areas for surface water irrigation, winding canals, laterals, decreased water loss, soil management, conversion to dryland. All these things are already identified in current regional water plans. Like I said, I think moving forward with the next regional plan, you're going to see a lot more these projects fleshed out a little bit more with identified sponsors as well. Willing, I think I went over maybe a little bit. I don't know how on time we are, but I have open for questions if we have time. I encourage you to take down my phone number, my email address. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. You just want to chat about something.